Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
You're a good teacher, Eric, but you're not what we're looking for this year. That was it. No explanation, no detail, no real acknowledgement of the 22 years I'd spent in room 104, teaching 7th grade social studies to hormonal preteens and caffeinated middle schoolers who barely knew the capital of their own state, let alone the Constitution. Just that single sentence, delivered with a condescending half-smile by Carl Bennett, the kind of principal who shook your hand with one of those limp, two-finger grasps and said words like synergy with a straight face. I sat there for a second. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. Because deep down, I'd seen this coming months ago. Maybe even a year ago, when the new assistant principal showed up. Lexi Halverson, 29, enthusiastic and deadly ambitious. The kind who calls herself a disruptor and puts inspirational quotes in her email signature. She'd stopped by my room once to observe, spent 7 minutes on her phone, then left without saying a word. I guess she decided I wasn't cutting edge enough for her vision. Still, I'd hoped maybe my work mattered. That showing up early, staying late, tutoring after school without pay, calling parents every week, helping kids get out of bad homes, all of it might count for something. I was wrong. Loyalty, turns out, is only valuable until it costs money. So I cleared out my desk. I packed up the goofy mug a student gave me years ago, world's okayest teacher, my drawer of emergency granola bars, a half-dead succulent, and 2 binders filled with lesson plans I wasn't paid to write. I left the posters. Let the new guy figure out how to get 30 kids interested in the Constitution without a little color on the walls. No goodbye lunch. No hallway send-off. Just the janitor pretending not to look at me as I walked past with a box in my arms. I got in my car, sat down, and let out the longest breath of my life. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just stared at the steering wheel and said out loud, well, that's that. And then I drove home. 3 hours later, sitting on my back porch with a beer and a bag of pretzels, I got a text from Linda Collins, one of the veteran science teachers who'd been there even longer than I had. It read, I heard. I'm so sorry. Total bullshit. That made it feel real. That's when the heat started building in my chest. It's funny. When something unfair happens to someone else, you know it's wrong. But when it happens to you, it doesn't feel like injustice right away. It feels like confusion. Like the world is out of order and you're the only one who missed the memo. But that text, that word, bullshit, cracked something open. Because yeah, that's what it was. Still, I kept quiet. I wasn't going to make a scene. I told myself, you're 58, not 25. You've got dignity. You'll leave with your head high. The next morning, I started getting emails. Not from the school. Not from Carl or Lexi. From parents. The subject lines were all the same flavor. What happened to Mr. Nolan? Or, is Mr. Nolan okay? At first, I answered politely. Just said, thank you for asking. I've moved on from the school, and I'm grateful for your support. A generic kind of answer, one that wouldn't get me in trouble. But the emails kept coming. More and more of them. Some from parents I hadn't heard from in years. One woman wrote, my daughter cried when she found out. She says you're the only teacher who ever made her feel smart. That one hit hard. And then came the big one. It was from a man named Thomas Redding, whose son I taught 8 years ago. The subject line, time to talk? His email was short. I work in education law now. You might want to give me a call. You're not the first. I stared at that email for a full 10 minutes before closing my laptop. I wasn't ready for whatever that meant. Not yet. But it stuck with me. And I started thinking back. Little things. Lexi's sudden classroom audits. Carl rewriting the performance evaluation forms a month ago. That staff meeting where the superintendent praised Lexi for identifying inefficiencies in staffing. And I remembered the 3 teachers who'd left last spring. All over 50. All retired early. All walked out just like me. One of them, Joan, from English, had been there for 30 years. And she'd left without saying goodbye to anyone. I thought she just wanted a quiet exit. Now I wasn't so sure. I started connecting dots I didn't want to see. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern. But here's the kicker. The moment that really threw me. On my last day, as I was carrying that stupid box of stuff out the front door, a student ran after me. 7th grader named Miguel. Quiet kid, used to doodle Spider-Man in the margins of his notes. Never said much. But he handed me a folded piece of paper and ran off before I could say anything. Inside, in shaky pencil, it said, thank you for believing in me. You're the only one who did. That's when I knew I wasn't the one who'd failed. They were. And if they thought I was just going to disappear quietly, they hadn't been paying attention in civics class. So let me ask you something. What would you do if your boss smiled in your face, stabbed you in the back, and expected you to just shut up and disappear? Because I tried that. I really did. But some things won't let you sleep at night. It started with a single email, short, polite, and tinged with just enough confusion to sting more than I expected, from a parent named Dana Moore, whose daughter Emily I taught 2 years ago, and who had always sent me Christmas cards with those shiny pictures of their dog in a Santa hat. Her subject line read, "We just heard what happened." The body of the message was only 3 sentences long, but the tone of it had something I hadn't expected, not just concern, but disbelief. "Emily told us you're no longer at the school. She's devastated. We're confused. Did you retire early, or was this a school decision?" I sat there staring at the email for several minutes, debating how honest I wanted to be. Part of me, the older part that had taught me to always take the high road even when that road felt more like a back alley in a bad part of town, wanted to just smile, type out some neutral sentence about stepping away to explore new opportunities, and leave it there. But then another email came in, and another. And within 48 hours, my inbox looked like a customer service hotline during a product recall, only instead of defective toasters. These folks were furious about the sudden disappearance of a man who'd taught their kids how the 3 branches of government worked and why the Bill of Rights wasn't just some trivia question on a state exam. One mother told me her son hadn't stopped crying for 2 days and had refused to participate in class now that I was gone. One dad, who barely spoke English when he first brought his daughter to my parent-teacher conference years ago, wrote a message that was broken and awkward in grammar but absolutely brutal in meaning. "You was best. Now bad people in charge. We mad." I tried to keep my replies short, measured, and appropriately vague. I didn't want to start a wildfire. I still believed, somehow, in professionalism, even when it had failed me. But the emails didn't slow down. If anything, they multiplied. And the tone began to shift. It went from "we're confused" to "we're angry." A group of parents CC'd the superintendent in an email demanding an explanation. They weren't buying the official line that I had resigned to pursue personal growth. One of them, a former corporate manager, even used the words "forced attrition" and "targeted dismissal," which I'd never heard in a school setting before but suddenly felt chillingly appropriate. Then came the phone calls. One night, around 9:30, my landline rang. Yes, I still have one, and it was Ron Henderson, whose twins I'd taught 4 years ago. He wasn't calling just to check in. He had questions. "Eric," he said, his voice sharp with that low simmer only fathers of daughters can channel, "I need to know. Did they push you out because of money, or age, or both?" I hesitated. "Ron, I really can't get into the—" He cut me off. "Bull. You gave them 20 years and they dumped you like expired milk. I've worked in HR for 3 decades. I know what this looks like." That conversation opened something in me I've been trying to keep shut. A door I didn't even want to admit was there. Because once you admit you were screwed over, you can't unadmit it. You start seeing all the signs you ignored, all the flags you waved away like they weren't warnings. By the end of that week, I had a folder on my desktop labeled Parent Emails. It had 73 messages in it. And then, like a spark landing in a dry field, came the leak. Someone, and to this day, I don't know who, posted a video on Facebook. It was shot from a student's phone, clearly from under a desk or behind a backpack, and it showed the new teacher, my replacement, a guy named Kyle who looked like he still got carded buying beer, completely losing control of the classroom. Kids shouting, paper flying, someone literally doing parkour on the furniture. Kyle just stood there, mouth open, hands up, muttering something that sounded like, guys, please." The caption read, "This is who they hired instead of Mr. Nolan." That video had 15,000 views in 2 days. The comments section was vicious. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't laughing. But deep inside, something started to shift. Not joy, exactly, not revenge either. More like a cold recognition that I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, staying quiet wasn't the noble thing I thought it was. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being pushed out of a job you loved. It doesn't just bruise your ego, it steals your sense of purpose. For years, I believed I mattered. I believed I was helping. That belief kept me showing up, even when I was tired, even when the kids were wild, even when the admin team forgot my birthday 3 years in a row and scheduled me for lunch duty on the same week I buried my father. And now that belief was gone, ripped out like a weed. But something else was growing in its place. resolve. And then came the message that really changed everything. It was a reply to one of the parent threads from a woman named Sarah Duvall, PDA co-president, business owner, and full-time bulldog in heels. Her message was short. I've contacted a few board members. If you're willing to talk, I think you should. That was the moment I stopped feeling fired. I started feeling dangerous because I still had every email, every memo, every evaluation, every ignored warning. And I wasn't the only one watching anymore. I was just the first one pushed. The thing about being a teacher for over 2 decades is that you pick up habits most people would never call useful, like saving emails from your principal dating back to when people still used AOL, or keeping handwritten notes from staff meetings that could have been emails in the first place. And it turns out, those habits start looking a lot like ammunition when the people running the show finally come for your head. After that message from Sarah Duvall about the board members, I didn't sleep for 2 nights straight, not from anxiety or fear, but because my brain had kicked into overdrive. Flipping through mental file cabinets of all the times I'd seen this exact kind of backdoor firing play out before. 3 years ago, it was Paul Whitaker, the woodshop teacher who was as harmless and kind as a golden retriever, pushed out under the vague accusation of being too set in his ways. Then it was Denise Fields, who taught English like it was a Broadway performance and brought kids out of their shells in ways no textbook ever could. She disappeared over spring break, no warning, no farewell. We all assumed she retired early, but now I wasn't so sure. So I went digging. I started in the attic, where I kept an old milk crate filled with file folders from a decade ago. Most people would have tossed that junk, but I had always been a bit sentimental or paranoid, depending on who you asked, and I kept everything. Inside, I found my original job offer letter from 1999, some paper copies of student thank you notes, and buried between 2 folders labeled field trips and grade appeals, a thick envelope of printed emails from Carl Bennett himself. Back when he was still vice principal and pretending to be everybody's friend. One of those emails caught my eye, dated May 24th, 2017. Subject line, Budget Efficiency Strategy. It outlined a plan, written in the most corporate, buzzword-saturated language imaginable, about optimizing staffing through experience to compensation ratio adjustments. That phrase stuck with me. I remember reading it back then and joking in the teacher's lounge that it was code for get rid of the old ones. Back then, I laughed. Now, it read like a confession. So I kept going. Every email Carl had ever sent me that contained a performance review, I cross-referenced with my student feedback, standardized test scores, and peer observations. I laid them all out like crime scene evidence. And when you put it all side by side, the story told itself. Glowing feedback, strong results, consistent growth, until suddenly, last year, everything became misaligned with evolving expectations. No specifics. Just a phrase that showed up like clockwork every time someone over 50 found themselves nudged out. But the real kicker, the thing that made my jaw tighten and my fingers curl around the edge of my desk, was an email chain I'd forgotten existed, dated just 6 months before I was let go. It started with me voicing concerns about our new history curriculum, which had been rushed in with zero teacher input and was riddled with errors. One quiz actually said the Civil War ended in 1905. I emailed Carl and Lexi both, professionally worded, respectful, but direct. I attached documentation. I even offered to help revise it. Carl never replied. Lexi did, one sentence. Thanks for your passion, but we're moving forward. That was it. 2 weeks later, I was randomly selected for a classroom audit. For weeks after that, I was asked to attend a growth opportunity session with a consultant who had no background in education, just a PowerPoint deck filled with images of light bulbs and hashtags like #FutureReady. Now, I don't claim to be a genius, but I do know how to follow a trail. And the trail led right back to Lexi. Her evaluations of my class were vague. Her comments sounded like they were copied and pasted from a rubric designed for a tech startup, and the words lacking innovation kept appearing in her summaries. Which is rich, considering she'd observed exactly 23 minutes of my teaching the entire year. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Joan. She was the English teacher I'd known since my first year, the one who left so quietly last spring that nobody even saw her go. I hadn't spoken to her since, assuming she'd moved on and didn't want to relive it. She answered on the second ring. Eric, she said, cautious, like someone answering a call from a debt collector. Yeah, I said. I think it's time we talked. What followed was an hour-long conversation that peeled back layer after layer of the rotting structure we'd both been teaching under. Joan hadn't wanted to leave. She'd been told she could retire gracefully or face performance intervention, despite having glowing records and years of student praise. She hadn't fought it. She didn't want to make waves. But now, hearing my story, she said something that stuck with me harder than anything else. I wish I'd pushed back, she said. I thought I was just unlucky. But it wasn't luck, was it? No, it wasn't. And I was done pretending it was. I compiled everything: emails, documents, notes, performance reviews, even old thank you cards from students. I scanned it all, converted it into a single PDF file, and titled it simply Timeline. And then, without overthinking it, I sent it. Not to the district. Not to Carl. I sent it to Sarah Duval. She replied 15 minutes later. One sentence. This is going to get loud. And for the first time in a long, long while, I smiled like I meant it. Because receipts don't just keep records, they prove you paid the price. The fire didn't start in some dramatic boardroom showdown or with a whistleblower going on the evening news. It started, of all places, in a church basement during a PDA meeting that hadn't seen more than 15 attendees in 3 years. Sarah Duval had told me she'd bring the timeline to their next gathering, but I hadn't expected her to read it out loud, line by line, pausing after each section like she was delivering courtroom evidence. According to her later description, the room went from bored murmuring over snack tables to dead silent within 5 minutes. And then came the gasps, the swearing under breath, and a few voices in the back demanding to see the documents for themselves. By the end of that meeting, the PDA wasn't just angry, they were organized. It's funny how quiet outrage simmers until someone finally gives it a voice loud enough to be heard. And in this case, that voice belonged to a mother of 3 who drove a minivan and wore motivational t-shirts, but spoke like a trial lawyer when she was pissed. She didn't just talk about me. She talked about every teacher who had vanished in the last 2 years without warning or fanfare. She brought up the budget discrepancies, the staff turnover, the sudden spike in administrative salaries that conveniently coincided with a drop in classroom funding. Parents who had nodded along politely for years were now sitting up straighter, flipping through copies of my email timeline and asking questions nobody wanted to hear. By the following week, the PDA had drafted an open letter addressed to the school board, signed by over 200 parents. It wasn't just a letter of concern, it was a demand for transparency, a request for a formal audit, and a vote of no confidence in Carl Bennett's leadership. They posted it online, attached the timeline PDF, and sent it to the local newspaper. The response from the school was exactly what I expected: defensive, vague, and dripping with that same tone of condescension they always used when talking to people they assumed wouldn't understand how complex the staffing process truly is. Carl sent out a school-wide email insisting all decisions had been made with the best interests of students in mind, and claimed that recent changes were part of a broader strategic realignment toward future-focused learning. That sentence alone made me want to punch my laptop. Strategic realignment? That's what you call booting a teacher who brought his own damn printer paper when the budget got cut? What they didn't expect, and this is where it got delicious, was for a local journalist to get involved. Her name was Rachel Lynn. Young, sharp, relentless. She worked for the county's independent paper, the kind nobody takes seriously until they break the kind of story that forces a school board to hold emergency sessions. She called me after someone passed her the PDA letter and asked if I'd be willing to talk. Off the record, of course. I hesitated at first, because after 22 years of watching what happened to people who stuck their necks out in public, I knew the system could punish you even when you were already out of it. But something in her voice reminded me of the kids I used to teach. The ones who refused to let a lie sit quietly when they knew the truth was sharper and louder. So I talked. I told her about the classroom audits, the evaluations filled with empty phrases, the meetings where I wasn't allowed to speak without being interrupted. I walked her through the emails, the patterns, the timeline. I even mentioned Joan, Denise, and Paul, the ones who had vanished just like me. She listened carefully, took notes, asked good questions, and promised not to publish a word without my okay. Meanwhile, back at the school, things were unraveling fast. The young guy who'd replaced me, Kyle, the deer in headlights with a bachelor's degree and a TikTok addiction, had resigned 2 weeks into the chaos. His exit email leaked too, and in it, he described the administration as hostile, the training as non-existent, and the expectations as comically unrealistic. When your shiny new hire runs screaming after a month, it doesn't take a genius to figure out you've got a problem. The school board finally scheduled an open forum to hear community concerns, which in theory sounds responsible, but in practice looked like a slow-motion implosion. Parents filled the room wall to wall, many holding copies of the PDA letter in one hand and printouts of my timeline in the other. Carl tried to keep things under control. I heard he even wore a new suit and opened with a lame joke about growing pains, but by the second question, things had already gone off the rails. A mother stood up, stared Carl dead in the eye, and asked why every teacher over 50 had vanished from the faculty roster within 2 years of Lexi's hiring. Carl tried to pivot. She didn't let him. The next parent asked why their kids' test scores had dropped. Another asked why the school was spending money on innovation consultants while the library's roof still leaked. Lexi didn't speak at all. She sat stiff and silent, her smile strained and disappearing by the second. And me? I wasn't even in the room. I was at home, watching the live stream on my laptop with a cup of coffee in one hand and a legal pad in the other, jotting down everything that sounded like it might eventually end up useful. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. Not exactly. It was about truth. About the years we give to a system that doesn't always give back. About the students we fight for, even when nobody's fighting for us. About being told we're obsolete, unnecessary, too old, too expensive, and realizing we were actually essential all along. The next morning, Rachel's article dropped. Headline: Veteran teachers, vanishing jobs, inside a school district's silent purge. It exploded. The district released a formal statement full of corporate buzzwords, and the superintendent called for an internal review. But the damage was done. Parents were mobilizing. Teachers were whispering. Reporters were calling. And the best part? None of it had come from me shouting into the void. I never raised my voice, never threw a fit, never made a scene. All I did was tell the truth, show my receipts, and wait. Turns out, that's more than enough when the truth is this damn ugly. The last time I walked through the school parking lot, I was carrying a cardboard box filled with personal artifacts and professional humiliation, my back turned to a place that had once been more home than workplace. I hadn't planned on returning, not to the building, not to the people, not to the constant noise of administrative hypocrisy dressed up as progress. But fate, or maybe just the mess I helped ignite, had a way of tugging me back for one last look. Carl Bennett was gone by then, not in a dramatic, security walks you out kind of way, but in the quiet, bureaucratic way these things tend to happen when people in power want to protect their own. The official statement said he'd chosen to pursue new opportunities outside the district, which anyone with half a brain knew was code for, we gave him the option to jump before we pushed. Lexi Halverson, for her part, hadn't gone far. They reassigned her to a different school, buried in a new district innovation role. That probably involved sitting in front of a laptop all day designing useless slide decks about engagement strategies no teacher asked for and no student would benefit from. There were no apologies, no letters of regret, no handshakes extended across the divide they'd created, just silence, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the smoke has cleared and the wounded have either walked away or disappeared. I didn't come back to settle scores. I came back because one of the students I'd mentored, a quiet, determined girl named Olivia, had asked if I would be willing to write a letter of recommendation for a leadership scholarship she was applying to. She wanted to be a teacher, of all things. After everything, that still got to me. When she told me, she said, I want to be the kind of teacher you were. Not just the smart kind, the kind that notices. So I showed up. Just for a minute. Just to hand-deliver the letter. I parked near the edge of the lot, where no one would recognize my car or stop me with awkward half-smiles and the kind of questions that aren't really questions at all. I kept my head down, walked past the side entrance, and made it as far as the main office before I heard it. My name, yelled across the asphalt like it was recess and someone had just spotted their best friend. Mr. Nolan. I turned, slowly, half expecting to see a face from the past. Instead, it was a 7th grader I didn't recognize, probably someone I'd had in homeroom or met briefly in a hallway years ago, sprinting toward me, backpack bouncing, glasses crooked, one shoe untied. He stopped in front of me, breathless, and smiled like I'd just stepped off a spaceship. You're the guy, he said, pointing. The one everybody talks about. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. I just smiled, handed Olivia's envelope to the secretary, who blushed and avoided my eyes, and walked out the door for the last time. Because here's the thing they never quite understand at the top, the ones in suits and title-heavy email signatures, The ones who use words like realignment and strategy like they mean something. They think people like me leave quietly because we're afraid. But we don't leave out of fear. We leave because we've already done what we came to do. And sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't mean burning it all down. It means stepping away and letting the truth burn in the light all on its own. I never sued the district. I could have, maybe. There was enough evidence, enough emails, enough witness statements to make things uncomfortable for everyone involved. But I didn't want to spend the next 2 years fighting a war of paperwork and lawyers. I wanted peace, the kind you earn after a long, hard road, not the kind they pretend to offer in settlement agreements. Instead, I used the momentum. Some of the parents, the same ones who flooded my inbox after I was pushed out, offered to help me start something new. Nothing big, just a community tutoring center run out of the old VFW hall, with space for students who needed help and couldn't afford the kind of attention they deserved. We called it the second desk because that's where the kids always sat when they needed just a little more time, a little more help, a little more belief. I don't teach 5 classes a day anymore. I don't grade 72 essays on Sunday nights or attend meetings where people nod thoughtfully and say nothing. But I still teach. I still show up. And now, I choose where and when and how. Some days, I miss it. The chaos, the rhythm, the strange magic of a classroom waking up after the bell rings. But then I remember what it cost me to stay. And I remember what it gave me to leave. This isn't revenge. This isn't a happy ending, either. It's something in between. Because when you give your heart to a system, and it spits you out like spoiled milk, you have 2 choices, get bitter or get smarter. And I'm too damn tired to be bitter anymore. So I got smart. I kept every receipt. I shared every story. I let the truth do its job. And now? Now, I drink my coffee on my porch every morning, read the paper without scanning for landmines, and wait for the next teacher to find me, because one always does, and ask how I did it. And I tell them the truth, same way I always did. They never saw me coming, and they'll never forget I was here. There are things they never write down, not in evaluations, not in contracts, not in any board policy tucked away in some dusty filing cabinet in the central office. Things like how many kids sat in your classroom too scared to speak until you taught them they had something worth saying, or how many times you pulled a student aside not because it was part of your job, but because you could see the cracks in their armor and knew that no one else was looking close enough to notice. They don't track how many lunches you gave up to sit with the kid who got bullied in the hallway or how often you stayed after hours tutoring someone who wasn't even in your class, just because they asked. They don't make space and performance reviews for how you kept granola bars in your bottom drawer for the ones who came to school hungry and too proud to say it out loud. And they sure as hell don't give you credit for the times you bit your tongue in meetings, holding back the truth because you knew speaking it would cost you, even if it might help somebody else. These are the things that don't show up in data dashboards, the invisible work that keeps the whole damn system from collapsing under the weight of its own buzzwords and bureaucracy. And for over 2 decades, I carried that weight like it was mine alone, not because I had to, but because I believed it mattered. So when they called me outdated or said I wasn't what the school needed moving forward, what they really meant was that I was too much of a mirror, too steady, too vocal, too unwilling to nod along, while they turned classrooms into corporate experiments and teachers into test proctors wearing forced smiles. They didn't want better educators. They wanted easier ones. After all of this, after the emails, the meetings, the quiet exits and the loud revelations, the newspaper article, and the slow unspooling of a truth they tried to bury, I never did hear directly from Carl again. No apology, no justification, not even a coward's attempt to spin the story in his favor. He just vanished, absorbed back into the network of administrators who fail upward, finding new jobs in new towns, dragging their damage behind them like luggage with broken wheels. But I kept getting messages, some from parents, some from teachers, a few even from former students who'd somehow heard what happened and wanted to tell me that I'd made a difference, that they remembered something I said, or how I said it, or how I didn't give up on them when they were making it really hard not to. One kid, now apparently a firefighter, wrote a message that said, "I still remember the way you made us learn the Constitution. You didn't just teach it, you made us argue about it. Now I actually use it when I speak up at city council meetings." That one nearly wrecked me. Because for all the bitterness I'd swallowed, all the righteous anger I'd poured into timelines and letters and one-sided conversations with my ceiling fan late at night, what I really needed, more than revenge, more than justice, More than seeing Lexi quietly reassigned and Carl disappear under the fog of his own mismanagement, was to know that I hadn't wasted my time, that it all meant something. And the funny thing is, I didn't have to scream that meaning from a mountaintop. I didn't have to torch the place on my way out. All I had to do was trust that the people who were paying attention, the ones who mattered, would see it for themselves. And they did. The school district didn't collapse. The board didn't all get fired. No one ended up in handcuffs or lawsuits or scandalous headlines beyond a brief local media cycle. But they got scared, not of me, not exactly, but of what I represented, a teacher who knew the game, played it well, and refused to play dumb when they tried to rig the board. Now, every time they walk into another meeting, every time they draft another policy, they'll wonder who's taking notes. They'll wonder what's being saved in a folder. They'll remember that pushing someone out quietly doesn't guarantee they'll stay quiet. I see more now than I used to, not just about the system, but about myself. I know that leaving was necessary, not because I couldn't keep teaching, but because I needed to stop letting people who had no idea what real teaching looked like define my worth. I needed to remember that I was never just a job title or a line item on a spreadsheet. I was a presence, a force, a constant, the kind of teacher who stayed after the bell, who showed up when no one else would, who remembered that every name on the attendance sheet came with a story that didn't end at the classroom door. And when I think about what they took from me, the position, the title, the chance to end on my own terms, I also think about what they couldn't take. My voice, my integrity, my story. So maybe this isn't a happy ending. Maybe it's just the end of one chapter in a story that started long before Carl ever learned to fake a smile and Lexi printed her first motivational poster. And maybe that's enough. Because even now, long after the classroom doors have closed behind me for good, I still get calls. Parents, teachers, students, people who say, "Hey, can you help with this kid?" Or, "Do you have a minute to look over something?" Or, "They're trying to push me out too." What do I do? And I always answer. Every time. Because I might not be a teacher on paper anymore, but in all the ways that count, I never stopped. I still notice. I still care. I still believe. They'll never write that down, but I'll remember it forever.